I was born into a number before I ever had a name. They tell me I came screaming into the recycled air of Hive Tertius on the 7th day of the 4th month, in some nameless hab block stacked so high the sun was a myth whispered by the elderly. My mother, I have no memory of her face, only the idea of her, must have held me once, must have looked down at the wet, squalling thing I was and thought something maternal. But that moment, if it ever existed, was brief. By the time I could focus my infant eyes, I was already property of the administratum. Designation 7 Gamma 4012. They stamped it into my records before I had teeth, a number that would follow me through every door, every shift change, every ration line, every cage. It was tattooed onto my left forearm in black ink mixed with synthetic antibiotics when I was 3 years old. I remember the pain, not the needle but the afterward, when the skin swelled and wept and I was told not to scratch it, told that this mark was sacred, that it identified me as a servant of the God Emperor, a cog in the vast and terrible machine of the Imperium. My earliest memory is not of comfort or warmth, it is of the sorting cages. Rows upon rows of children, all of us under the age of 5, packed into wire pens beneath flickering lumens that buzzed like carrion flies. The air was wet and smelled of unwashed bodies, of urine-soaked bedding, of the disinfectant they sprayed on us twice a week that burned our eyes and throats. We did not cry. Crying earned you a shock from the overseer's discipline prods, short, brutal jolts that taught us silence faster than words ever could. The overseers wore brass goggles that caught the sickly light and turned their eyes into blank, insectile reflections. They moved between the cages, with data slates clutched in gloved hands, measuring us, not with kindness, not with curiosity, with assessment. They measured the width of our shoulders, the density of our bones, the strength of our grip when they forced our tiny hands around metal bars. They pried open our mouths and counted teeth, shone lights into our eyes to check for mutation or weakness, listened to our hearts with cold stethoscopes pressed against our thin chests, timing the beats, logging the rhythms. Some children were taken away and never returned. The overseers called them unviable stock. I learned later they were rendered into protein paste, or sent to the lower generatoria as plasma fodder, or simply discarded into the acid sumps beneath the hive. The Imperium does not waste, but it does discard. There is a difference. I was catalogued as viable, laborer class, muscle density acceptable, skeletal structure sufficient for industrial work, cognitive function low priority, suitable for instruction-based tasks, no signs of mutation, no signs of heretical bloodline, no signs of anything that might make me more than what I was, a body that could lift, carry, and obey. They fed us twice a day. Nutrient paste dispensed from steel spouts into our cupped hands or into shallow troughs if there were too many of us to manage individually. It was gray-brown, the consistency of wet sand, and it tasted of rust and something else, something organic and wrong that I would later recognize as rendered protein. Recycled human remains, most likely. The dead fed the living in Hive Tertius. The overseers said it was the Emperor's will, that nothing must be wasted in his service. I learned to eat without thinking, to swallow without tasting, to let the paste slide down my throat and settle heavy in my stomach, where it would sit like a stone until the next feeding. Hunger was constant. Not the sharp kind that makes you desperate, but the dull, gnawing ache that became part of your existence. Background noise. A reminder that you were alive only because you were useful. By the time I was 6, I understood the structure of my world. To live was to serve. To serve was to be measured. And to be measured was to be found either adequate or wanting. There was no middle ground. No mercy, no exception. The God Emperor, whose name was invoked before every shift and after every meal, did not care for individuals. He cared for function, for output, for the perpetuation of the species across a galaxy that wanted us dead. I did not resent this. Resentment requires the knowledge that something else is possible. I knew only the cage, the sorting, the paste, the designation burned into my arm. I knew the hymns we were taught to recite in monotone voices. Blessed is the worker, for through toil is salvation earned. Blessed is the obedient, for through submission is order maintained. I knew the sting of the discipline prod when I moved too slowly, spoke too loudly, or failed to acknowledge an overseer's command with the proper deference. I did not know that I would be reclassified 7 times before my body was finally rendered into its component parts. I did not know that the number on my arm would follow me through labor tithes, conscription, contamination, augmentation, and conversion. That it would change, subtly, cruelly, with each new assessment, each new purpose they found for my failing flesh. I did not know that I would live long enough to become the very paste I ate as a child. But standing in that sorting cage at 6 years old, gripping the wire with hands too small to understand their future, I learned the only lesson that mattered. You are not a person, you are a designation, and your value is measured in what you can carry until you break. 20 years, that's how long I hauled munitions crates through sub-level Forge 88, deep in the industrial bowels of Hive Tertius, where the air itself became a weapon against your lungs. 20 years of lifting, carrying, stacking, and dragging loads that grew heavier as my body learned to endure what should have broken it. 20 years of watching men and women collapse beside me, their hearts giving out or their spines snapping under weights that the overseers deemed within acceptable parameters for laborer class physiology. I was 26 years old when they assigned me to the Forge, young by Hive standards, strong enough to be useful, stupid enough not to complain. The heat was the first thing that struck you, not warmth, not even uncomfortable temperature. This was heat that had mass and presence, that pressed against your skin like a living thing trying to cook you from the outside in. The air shimmered in waves, distorting the rows of manufacturing machinery that stretched beyond sight into the red-lit darkness. Breathing was like swallowing hot tar, each inhalation thick and oily, coating your throat, filling your lungs with air so heavy you felt like you were drowning on dry land. The Forge never stopped. Day and night were meaningless concepts in the sub-levels. The lumens burned constant, the machinery roared eternal, and the work crews rotated in shifts that blurred together into one endless cycle of exhaustion. We worked 16 hours, slept 4 in the communal racks that stank of sweat and metal shavings, then returned to the floor for another 16. Week after week, month after month, year after year. My job was simple: move the munitions crates from the fabrication lines to the loading platforms. Each crate weighed approximately 80 kilograms. Some contained artillery shells, others bolter rounds, still others held plasma canisters that hummed with barely contained energy and made your teeth ache if you held them too long. We were told never to drop them, never to let them strike the ground with force. The overseer showed us once what happened when a plasma canister ruptured. They threw one from a gantry onto the factory floor and let us watch as it burned through rockcrete and turned a service servitor into a screaming column of white fire. The Emperor's munitions are sacred, the overseer said, his voice crackling through the vox speakers mounted on every pillar. Your lives are not. Remember which matters more. I learned to lift with my legs, not my back. Learned to bend my knees and use my whole body as leverage, letting the weight settle into my core before standing. Learn to breathe in rhythm. Exhale on the lift, inhale on the carry, exhale on the placement. It became meditation, mindless repetition that allowed my thoughts to drift somewhere distant while my body performed its function. My hands transformed over the years. The soft flesh of youth hardened into calluses thick as leather, yellow-brown and cracked at the edges. My palms developed permanent grooves where the crate handles pressed into them thousands of times per shift. My fingers grew stiff, the joints swollen from constant strain. I could no longer fully straighten them. They curved slightly inward even at rest, shaped by the ghost of handles I'd gripped for 2 decades. My back bent, too, slowly, imperceptibly at first, but by my mid-30s I noticed that standing fully upright required conscious effort, and caused sharp pains to shoot through my lower spine. I developed a permanent forward hunch, shoulders rolled in, head jutting forward like the iron beams that supported the forge ceiling above us. We all did. You could identify a forge worker by posture alone, bodies shaped by labor into permanent positions of submission. The food was the same nutrient paste from my childhood, now dispensed from automated stations at the edge of the work floor. You had 6 minutes to eat during your break. 6 minutes to gulp down the grey-brown sludge, drink your ration of recycled water that tasted of chlorine and rust, and return to your station. If you were late, you were docked half a day's rations. If you were late twice, you were disciplined. If you were late 3 times, you disappeared. We did not ask where the disappeared went. We knew. When the war fleet departed, I never learned which war, which fleet, which enemy the Imperium was fighting that season. The production quotas doubled overnight. The overseers announced it during shift change, reading from a data slate with the casual indifference of someone ordering breakfast. By order of the Departamento Munitorum, sub-level Forge 88 production output will increase by 200% effective immediately. The Emperor protects those who serve without question. No additional workers were assigned. No additional rest was granted. We simply worked faster, lifted more, carried heavier loads with shorter intervals between them. 3 workers collapsed per shift now, on average, sometimes 4, sometimes 5. I watched a man named Toric, at least I think that was his designation, we weren't encouraged to remember names, suffer a catastrophic heart failure mid-lift. He made a sound like a wet cough, dropped the crate he was carrying, and crumpled sideways onto the metal grating. His eyes stayed open, staring at nothing, while his body twitched through its final nerve firings. Within 30 seconds, a Medicae servitor arrived, its movements precise and emotionless. It scanned Toric's body with a flickering red auger lens, logged something on an internal databank, then dragged him away by the ankle toward the reclamation chutes. The crate he'd dropped was undamaged. I picked it up and continued his delivery route. That was when my designation changed for the first time since childhood. I didn't notice it immediately. The shift was subtle, a bureaucratic reclassification buried in administratum paperwork that no one explained to common workers. But I noticed the effects. My ration chits began to dispense less food. My work assignments increased in load, weight, and frequency. The overseers began referring to me not as laborer, but as bulk hauler, a term that carried implications I didn't yet understand. It meant I was strong enough to carry more, durable enough to withstand higher quotas, expendable enough that if I broke, the loss would be statistically acceptable. "You should be grateful," an overseer told me once when I was caught pausing for breath between loads. He pressed the discipline prod against my ribs, not activating it, just letting me feel the cold metal through my sweat-soaked work tunic. "You're still alive. That means the Emperor has use for you. Some workers don't make it past their first year. You've survived 20, that's practically blessed." I nodded, said nothing, lifted the next crate, because he was right, in the only way that mattered in the Imperium. I was surviving. My body hadn't broken yet. My designation still classified me as functional, and in a galaxy where trillions died screaming in the dark, forgotten and unmourned, the fact that I was still breathing meant something. It meant I was useful. And as long as I remained useful, I would continue. Lifting, carrying, bending, breaking slowly, piece by piece, cell by cell, until the day my body could no longer perform its function and I would be reclassified into something else, something worse. The conscription order arrived on the morning of my 39th birthday, though I didn't know it was my birthday and wouldn't have cared if I did. It came in the form of a printed scroll, delivered by a junior administratum clerk who looked no older than 15, his face still soft with youth that the Imperium hadn't yet ground away. He stood at the entrance to the communal sleeping racks, unrolling the parchment with trembling hands, and began reading names. Not names, actually. Designations: 7 Gamma 4012, 7 Gamma 4089, 7 Gamma 4156, 37 designations in total. We were ordered to report to Sub-Level Processing Bay 14 within the hour, bringing nothing, saying nothing, asking nothing. The Emperor required our service in a new capacity. Our labor tithe had been fulfilled. Now came the tithe of blood. The clerk's voice cracked when he read the final line. By the authority of the Departamento Munitorum and the blessing of the God Emperor of mankind, you are hereby conscripted into the Astra Militarum. Your sins, inherited, committed, or potential, will be absolved through service. The Emperor protects. We were not asked if we consented. Consent was not a concept that applied to people like us. The processing bay smelled of disinfectant, weapon oil, and the red wax they used to seal official documents. That smell, tallow and authority, would haunt me for years afterward. They stripped us naked, hosed us down with chemical cleanser that burned our skin pink and raw, then shaved our heads with electric razors that nicked scalps and left bloody trails through the stubble. We were examined again, just as we'd been in the sorting cages as children. But this time the assessment was military. They checked our teeth for rot, tested our reflexes with small hammers tapped against our knees, measured lung capacity by forcing us to blow into tubes until we gasped, injected us with a cocktail of vaccines and combat stimulants that made our hearts race and our vision blur. Then they gave us our new designation, Infantry Unit 7G 4012, assigned to the 408th Penal Legion. I didn't know what penal meant then. I learned quickly. The 408th was composed entirely of conscripts deemed expendable, hive workers who'd outlived their industrial usefulness, minor criminals whose offenses didn't warrant execution but required punishment, genetic undesirables who'd failed purity screenings but weren't quite mutant enough to burn. We were the dregs, the human chaff, the bodies you threw at enemy positions to exhaust their ammunition before sending in real soldiers. They issued us our equipment in a warehouse that echoed with the shuffling of thousands of feet. Flak armor that hung loose on some, tight on others, never quite fitting anyone properly. The plates were scratched and dented, recycled from previous wearers who no longer needed them. I found a Lasburn scar on the chest plate of mine, a blackened crater where some previous owner had taken a shot that presumably killed him. I wondered briefly if his body had been rendered into the nutrient paste I'd eaten for decades. Probably. The las guns were in better condition than the armor, but not by much. They issued me a Mark III infantry pattern, its power pack flickering amber instead of steady green, indicating diminished charge capacity. The stock was cracked and reinforced with wire. The barrel had been rebored at least twice, leaving the interior rifling uneven. I was given 30 seconds of instruction: point the end with the hole at the enemy, pull the trigger, don't shoot your fellow guardsmen. The Emperor protects. That was the extent of our training. We were loaded into bulk transport ships, massive cathedral-like vessels that stank of incense and recycled air, and shipped off-world. I never learned the name of the planet we were sent to. It had a designation like everything in the Imperium, but no one bothered telling us what it was. It was simply the front, the place where the shooting was happening, the place where the Emperor needed bodies. The world was grey, grey sky, grey mud, grey smoke rising from grey ruins in the distance. Even the enemy, when I finally saw them, seemed grey, though I think that was just the exhaustion blurring my vision. We were marched directly from the landing zone into the trenches, a network of ditches carved through mud that had the consistency of wet clay and smelled of things that had died and been left to rot. The trenches were filled with water up to our ankles. Not clean water. This was a slurry of mud, urine, chemical runoff, and the liquefied remains of soldiers who'd fallen and been trampled into the sludge. You could feel solid things beneath your boots sometimes, equipment, weapons, bodies compressed into the trench floor by the weight of thousands of boots marching over them day after day. We were given our orders by a commissar whose face I never saw clearly. He wore a peaked cap pulled low and a greatcoat that made him look like a pillar of shadow. His voice was clipped, efficient, without emotion. You will hold this trench. You will fire upon the enemy when they advance. You will not retreat. Retreat is treason. Treason is death. The Emperor protects those who stand firm. Those who run will be shot. Am I understood? We mumbled our affirmations. He drew his bolt pistol, a massive gleaming weapon that looked obscene in its beauty compared to our battered lasguns, and fired a single shot into the head of a conscript who'd mumbled too quietly. The man's skull vaporized in a spray of bone and brain matter that spattered across 3 soldiers standing nearby. I asked if I was understood. Yes, Commissar, we shouted in unison, our voices cracking with fear. Good. The Emperor protects. Then he walked away, his polished boots somehow remaining clean despite the filth we stood in. The first attack came at dawn, or what I assumed was dawn. The grey sky lightened slightly from black to charcoal, and then we heard the whistling, artillery shells arcing through the air, screaming down toward our position with mechanical precision. The impacts were deafening, throwing up geysers of mud and shrapnel that shredded anyone caught in the open. I pressed myself against the trench wall, my hands clamped over my ears, and prayed to an emperor I'd never seen and wasn't sure I believed in. Then came the enemy infantry. They emerged from the smoke like apparitions, humanoid shapes moving with unnatural coordination, firing weapons that crackled with energy I didn't understand. I pointed my lasgun over the trench lip and pulled the trigger, again and again, the recoil slamming into my shoulder, the heat building in the barrel until I could feel it through my gloves. I don't know if I killed anyone. I don't know if my shots hit anything except mud and smoke. All I know is that I fired until my power pack died, slammed in a new one with shaking hands, and fired again. Men screamed around me, some from wounds, some from madness, some just because screaming was the only response left to them. For 5 years I did this. 5 years of trenches and mud and watching friends, or at least familiar designations, vanish in bursts of las fire or artillery strikes. 5 years of pulling the trigger until my fingers cramped, of sleeping in water, of eating cold rations that tasted worse than the forge nutrient paste. 5 years of becoming something less than human, something more like a machine that existed only to fire a weapon when ordered. My soul grew cold, not from cruelty, from absence, from the slow erosion of whatever spark had once made me a person rather than a function. I stopped remembering names, stopped mourning the dead, stopped feeling anything except the dull mechanical rhythm of survival: wake, eat, shoot, sleep, wake, eat, shoot, sleep. By the time the 408th Penal Legion was reduced to 8 combat effectiveness, I had fired my lasgun approximately 43,000 times. I know because the weapon's machine spirit kept count, a small numerical display beneath the barrel that tracked rounds fired. I watched that number climb with the same detachment I'd felt watching Toric die on the forge floor. They pulled us from the line finally, what was left of us, loaded us into transports again, shipped us somewhere else. My designation changed during transit: expendable asset, suitable for hazardous reclamation operations. I didn't ask what that meant. By then I'd learned that asking changed nothing. The Imperium would tell you what you needed to know, when you needed to know it, and never a moment before. All I knew was that I'd survived another reclassification, and that whatever came next would be worse. The world they sent us to had no name that anyone shared with us. Even the administrator manifests referred to it only as Reclamation Zone Epsilon 7, a designation as cold and impersonal as the landscape itself. It had been a forge world once, they told us during the brief orientation that passed for preparation. A vast industrial complex devoted to producing war materiel for the Emperor's armies, its factories stretching across an entire continent, its foundries burning hot enough to be seen from orbit. Then the enemy came, no one specified which enemy, there were so many, and reduced it to ash and slag and radioactive wasteland. But the Mechanicus does not abandon its sacred machines lightly. Somewhere in the irradiated ruins were cogitators containing irreplaceable data, STC fragments, blessed machine components that could not be replicated, relics of the Omnisia that the tech priests deemed worth recovering, even if the cost was measured in human lives, our lives, the expendable ones. There were 47 of us in the reclamation crew, all survivors of various penal legions, all bearing the physical and psychological scars of extended combat service. We were issued radiation suits, bulky, rubberized things that smelled of chemical treatment and old sweat, their seams patched multiple times with adhesive tape that was already peeling. The suits were transparent enough at the joints that you could see the yellow-brown staining from previous wearers, bodily fluids that had seeped through and never been properly cleaned. Each suit came with a Geiger counter strapped to the chest, a small rectangular device with a needle that twitched behind scratched glass, and a speaker that clicked when it detected radiation. Slow clicks meant background radiation, dangerous but survivable for limited exposure. Fast clicks meant elevated levels. A steady, high-pitched scream meant you were standing in a kill zone and your cells were already dying. Your suits will protect you for approximately 4 to 6 hours in standard radiation environments, the Mechanicus overseer explained, his voice flat and emotionless through his Vox grill. His face was more metal than flesh, his eyes replaced with augmetic lenses that glowed red in the dim light of the transport bay. After that, material degradation will compromise seal integrity. You will be rotated out before suit failure occurs. Probably. That last word hung in the air like poison gas. We deployed at dawn, shuttled down to the surface in bulk landers that shook so violently I thought we'd crash before reaching the ground. The rear ramp dropped with a hydraulic hiss, and we got our first look at Reclamation Zone Epsilon-7. It was hell rendered in shades of grey and rust. The landscape stretched out like a corpse, broken ferrocrete structures jutting from poisoned earth like shattered bones, twisted metal frameworks that had once been buildings now collapsed into abstract sculptures of destruction. The ground itself was cracked and blackened, covered in a fine ash that rose in small clouds with every step. The sky was a toxic yellow-brown, thick with particulates that filtered the sun into a weak, sickly glow. And the sound. The Geiger counters began their clicking the moment we stepped off the ramp. Not fast, not slow. A steady, rhythmic tick-tick-tick that burrowed into your brain and never stopped. It was the sound of death happening slowly, invisibly, cell by cell. Our objective was a collapsed administratum complex approximately 3 kilometers from the landing zone. Somewhere in its ruins was a cogitator vault containing data the Mechanicus wanted. Our job was to dig through the rubble, locate the vault, extract the cogitator cores and bring them back. Simple, straightforward, except for the radiation and the corpses. The dead were everywhere. Some were fresh, guardsmen from previous reclamation crews, their bodies still wearing radiation suits that had failed them. Others were older, reduced to skeletons by time and radiation, their bones fused to the metal they'd died against. And some were older still, original inhabitants of the Forge world, killed in whatever attack had destroyed this place. These were the worst. The radiation had done something to them, preserved them in twisted poses of agony, their flesh blackened and cracked like overcooked meat but refusing to fully decompose. We found one man, or what had been a man, sitting upright against a wall, his mouth open in a scream that would last until the planet's sun burned out. His hands were fused to a control panel he'd been trying to operate. The flesh melted into the metal, creating a permanent monument to his final futile moment. I tried not to look at the bodies, tried to focus on the work. We dug through rubble with reinforced shovels and industrial pry bars, shifting chunks of ferrocrete that weighed more than a man, clearing paths through collapsed corridors where the air was so thick with dust you could barely see 3 meters ahead. The work was brutal, made worse by the radiation suits that restricted movement and trapped heat inside until you felt like you were being slowly boiled alive. My Geiger counter clicked steadily, always present, always reminding me that I was dying. After the first week, my hair started falling out. Not all at once, just gradually, coming loose in clumps when I removed my helmet at the end of each shift. I'd run my gloved hand over my scalp and watch strands drift away like ash. By the second week, I was completely bald, my scalp covered in red irritated patches that wept clear fluid and stung when touched. Others had it worse. A man named 9 Delta 2241 began vomiting blood on the 10th day. His gums bled constantly, staining his teeth pink. He worked for 3 more days before collapsing mid-dig, convulsing in the radioactive dust while his Geiger counter screamed. They dragged him back to the medical tent where a bored Medicaid stamped his file and sent him to recovery facilities. We never saw him again. My teeth began loosening in my jaw by week 3. I could feel them shift when I bit down on the protein bars we were issued, hard, tasteless bricks that required significant chewing. I learned to eat carefully to avoid putting pressure on the teeth that felt loosest. One fell out during my sleep, and I woke with blood on my pillow and a gap in my smile that my tongue kept finding. The work continued regardless. We found the cogitator vault on day 26. It was buried under 12 meters of collapsed ceiling, protected by armored doors that had warped in the heat but held their seal. It took us 4 days to cut through with plasma torches, working in shifts because the radiation levels near the vault were high enough that our counters produced a continuous angry buzzing rather than discrete clicks. Inside, we found the cogitator cores, massive cylindrical devices covered in brass fittings and purity seals, humming with residual power despite decades of abandonment. The Mechanicus overseers treated them with reverence that bordered on worship, chanting hymns in binary as they supervised the extraction. They treated us like the machinery we operated, necessary but ultimately disposable. By the time we loaded the last cogitator onto the transport skids, 31 of the original 47 crew members were dead or too contaminated to continue working. I was 47 years old. My body had aged 20 years in the span of 2 months. My skin had a gray-yellow tint, stretched tight over bones that seemed more prominent than they should be. My hands trembled constantly, fine motor control degraded by nerve damage. The Medicaid who examined us at the end of the operation worked with clinical detachment, scanning us with auger devices and logging data onto data slates without meeting our eyes. When my turn came, he pressed the scanner against my chest, watched it display numbers I couldn't interpret, then stamped my file with 3 different seals. Biologically compromised, he said, his voice muffled behind a surgical mask. Reduced cognitive function expected within 18 months. Cellular degradation irreversible, suitable for low-priority labor assignments only. He handed me a slip of parchment with my new designation 7G4012RC. Radiation contaminated. You're being transferred to a penitent work crew, he continued, already moving to the next patient. Mining colony, promethium extraction. The atmosphere there is corrosive, but you're already damaged, so it won't matter much. The Emperor protects. I looked down at the parchment in my hands, at the stamps and seals that reduced my contamination and suffering to bureaucratic notation, and felt nothing. Not anger, not despair, not even resignation. Just the hollow emptiness of someone who'd been measured again and found still useful enough to exploit, but not valuable enough to heal. They shipped us out the next morning. loading us into the cargo holds of bulk transports like the contaminated equipment we'd become. As the ship lifted off, I caught one last glimpse of Reclamation Zone Epsilon 7 through a small viewport. A dead world, grey and lifeless, where we'd traded pieces of ourselves for machines that the Imperium deemed more important than our lives. My Geiger counter, still strapped to my chest, continued its quiet clicking, even in the ship, even surrounded by shielding and metal and the void of space. The radiation was inside me now, part of me, killing me slowly, cell by cell, in a death that would take years to complete. And the Imperium would use every single one of those years. I lasted 6 years on the Prometheum moon before my lungs finally betrayed me. The moon had a designation, something with numbers and letters that I've since forgotten, but the workers called it the Scar because that's what it looked like from orbit, a massive puckered wound on the face of reality, its surface carved open by centuries of mining operations that had hollowed out its interior like a rotted tooth. The atmosphere was technically breathable. Technically, it contained oxygen in ratios sufficient to sustain human life, along with sulfur compounds, industrial particulates, and trace elements of promethium vapor that gave the air a yellow tinge and made it taste like burning metal. Every breath was an act of violence against your respiratory system, a slow, cumulative poisoning that the administratum calculated into worker lifespan projections with actuarial precision. Expected operational duration for radiation-contaminated workers, 7 years. I exceeded projections. The overseers noted this in my file, as if it were an achievement. The work was simpler than the reclamation operations, but more monotonous. We operated drilling equipment in the deep shafts, extracting raw promethium from deposits thousands of meters below the surface. The drills were massive, industrial machines that screamed when they bit into stone, filling the tunnels with noise that made your bones vibrate and your teeth ache. We worked in near total darkness, our only illumination coming from helmet-mounted lumens that cast harsh white circles in the murk. The promethium seeped from the rock face in slow, viscous streams, thick, black fluid that stank of ancient decay and burned exposed skin on contact. We collected it in drums that we hauled to processing stations on manual cart rails, pushing loads that grew heavier as our bodies grew weaker. I noticed the breathing problems in my 3rd year. At first, it was just slight breathlessness after heavy exertion, something I attributed to age and the general deterioration my body had undergone. But it worsened gradually. Climbing the shaft ladders left me gasping. Pushing the promethium carts made my chest burn. Eventually, even speaking more than a few words required pauses to catch my breath. The cough started shortly after. Wet, rattling sounds that brought up black phlegm streaked with blood. Other workers developed it too. It was called the scar cough, an inevitable consequence of breathing the moon's atmosphere for extended periods. Some men coughed so violently they cracked ribs, others coughed until they vomited, then returned to work with bile still dripping from their chins. The Medicae station was a prefabricated structure near the primary shaft entrance, staffed by a single administratum physician who looked perpetually exhausted and 3 servitors whose medical programming was limited to basic triage. I reported there on the morning I coughed up something solid, a chunk of tissue that might have been lung lining, grey-black and fibrous. The physician was a thin woman with augmetic eyes that whirred when they focused, scanning me with mechanical precision. She pressed a stethoscope against my bare chest. My skin had taken on a permanent grey-yellow tint by then, stretched thin over ribs that showed clearly, and listened to the wet, laboured sounds my lungs made. "Pulmonary fibrosis," she said flatly, making notations on her data slate. "Atmospheric damage compounded by previous radiation exposure. Lung capacity at approximately 40% normal function, and declining." "Can you—" I started to ask, but the coughing took me again, doubling me over, bringing up more blood. "No," she interrupted once I'd finished. Your damage is irreversible. However, you remain suitable for continued labor with mechanical assistance." She gestured to one of the servitors, which approached with a tray of surgical implements and a device I didn't recognize. A metal apparatus roughly the size of a fist, covered in tubes and brass fittings, with a respirator mask attached by flexible hoses. "This is a Mark IV industrial respirator," the physician explained with the tone of someone who'd given this speech many times before. "It will be surgically implanted into your chest cavity and interface directly with your pulmonary system. It will mechanically assist your breathing, allowing you to maintain operational capacity despite tissue degradation." Will there be anesthetic?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked at me with those mechanical eyes, her expression unreadable. "Anesthetic is reserved for priority personnel and critical medical procedures. This is neither. You are classified as expendable labor stock. The Emperor's mercy is not wasted on the failing." She paused, then added with what might have been sympathy, though it was hard to tell, "You may bite down on this." She handed me a strip of leather. The surgery happened on a metal table in a side room that smelled of disinfectant and old blood. 2 servitors held me down, their grips inhumanly strong, their faces expressionless, while the physician made the first incision. I will not describe the details. Some memories are too visceral, too horrific to translate into words that could make another person understand. I will say only that I felt everything, every cut, every insertion, every moment when she cracked my ribs slightly outward to create space for the respirator housing, the sound like green wood breaking, every second when she connected the device to my lungs with surgical tubing, threading foreign objects through tissue that screamed in protest. I bit through the leather strip, tasted blood, my own, from where I'd bitten through my tongue, screamed until my voice broke into hoarse gasping. The servitors never loosened their grip. When it was finished, the physicians sealed the incision with surgical staples, simple metal clips that pulled the flesh together without finesse or care for scarring. The respirator housing protruded slightly from my chest, a rectangular bulge beneath the skin with tubes that emerged near my collarbone and connected to the mask I would now wear constantly. "The device will require daily maintenance," she instructed, handing me a small toolkit. "Clean the intake filters, monitor the pressure gauge. If it fails, report immediately for replacement or recycling, depending on your remaining operational value." She stamped my file with new seals and designations: 7G4112 AUG, augmented labor stock, suitable for hazardous environment exploitation. "You're being transferred to Shrine World Penance 7, she continued. "Unguent production facilities, report to the transport bay in 6 hours. Then she moved to the next patient, already forgetting I existed. Shrine World Penance the 7th was not actually a shrine world in the devotional sense. It had earned its designation through bureaucratic error centuries ago, and the name had stuck, despite bearing no relation to its actual function. It was an industrial nightmare, a planet whose atmosphere was composed primarily of acidic mists created by geological venting and industrial runoff, where we distilled sacred unguents and ritual oils from caustic chemical clouds. The work required us to operate massive distillation towers that rose into the poisonous fog, collecting the mist in filtration systems and processing it through refinement stages that produced oils the ecclesiarchy deemed holy. Why the church needed oils distilled from toxic waste, I never understood. Ours was not to question. Ours was to breathe through our masks and work until we collapsed. The acidic mist burned. Even through protective gear, it found ways to reach your skin. It condensed on exposed surfaces and dripped, eating through clothing and flesh with patient malevolence. My hands developed weeping sores that never fully healed, the skin cracked and leaking clear fluid that stung when it contacted anything. My face, what little was exposed around my respirator mask, became a landscape of chemical burns, layered scars upon scars, until I resembled something sculpted from melted wax. I worked alongside criminals serving labor penance, murderers, thieves, heretics, whose deviations were minor enough to permit reformation through suffering. And I worked alongside others like me, men and women, who'd been ground down by the Imperium's mechanisms until we were nothing but functional remnants, kept alive through crude augmetics and chemical stimulants injected at the start of each shift. There was a mirror in the communal washing station, scratched and clouded, but reflective enough. I made the mistake of looking into it once, 3 years into my posting. The face that looked back was not mine. It was a skull wrapped in gray-yellow skin, stretched so tight I could count every bone structure beneath. My eyes had sunk deep into their sockets, surrounded by dark circles that made them look like voids. My mouth hung slightly open because the respirator mask pulled at my facial muscles, creating a permanent expression of exhausted horror. The chemical burns had erased any remaining features that might have identified me as the person I'd once been. I was 56 years old. I looked 90. The overseers no longer addressed me by anything resembling a name, or even my original designation. I was Production Unit 7G 4012 OG. My worth was measured in liters of unguent processed per shift, my value calculated in output metrics that appeared on data slates carried by men who would never meet my eyes. I was no longer human in their assessment. I was a tool that required maintenance, a machine made of meat that happened to still be operational. And when my spine began to collapse, when the decades of heavy lifting and bent-to-back labor finally compressed my vertebrae beyond recovery, when the pain became so constant that even the chemical stimulants couldn't mask it, they made their final assessment. The physician who examined me was different from the one on the Prometheum moon, but his conclusion was identical in its cold, bureaucratic efficiency. Spinal degradation severe, multiple compression fractures, structural integrity insufficient for continued physical labor. He scanned me with devices that hummed and clicked, logging data with mechanical disinterest. However, subject retained sufficient cognitive function for basic task processing. Motor control adequate despite skeletal damage. He stamped my file with a seal I'd never seen before, a cogwheel symbol combined with a human skull. Viable for servitor conversion, he said, as if commenting on the weather. Cranial function sufficient for basic programming. You're being transferred to conversion facility Tertius 9 for processing. I opened my mouth to speak, to protest, to beg, to do something I hadn't done in decades. But all that came out was the wet, mechanical wheeze of my respirator, and a sound that might have been a word once before my voice had been worn away by years of screaming and silence. The physician noted my attempted vocalization in his data slate. Subject displays residual emotional responses, he dictated to the recording servitor. Unlikely to complicate conversion procedures, psychological conditioning should proceed as standard. Then he moved on to his next patient, and I was left alone with my new designation, my failing body, and the terrible knowledge of what came next. They came for me in the middle of what I thought was night, though time had lost meaning in the acidic fog of Penance 7. 2 servitors, humanoid shapes moving with mechanical precision, their faces blank as ceramite, flanked my cot and gripped my arms with cold, unyielding hands. I was too weak to resist, too broken to run. My spine sent jagged bolts of agony through my body with every movement, pain so intense it whited out my vision and left me gasping into my respirator. They dragged me to a transport shuttle without explanation, without ceremony, without acknowledgement that I was anything more than cargo being relocated. The journey to conversion facility Tertius-9 took 3 days, or perhaps 3 weeks. I drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain medication they'd administered barely dulling the agony radiating from my collapsed spine. When I was aware, I stared at the other prisoners being transported with me. 37 souls, all designated for conversion. Some were missing limbs already. Others bore the same grey-yellow skin of radiation poisoning, or the chemical burns of industrial labor, or the vacant expressions of those whose minds had broken long before their bodies. None of us spoke. We had nothing left to say. The facility was a massive complex of grey rockcrete and steel, crowned with the cogwheel symbol of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and surrounded by defensive batteries that tracked our shuttle's approach with mechanical interest. We landed in a processing bay that smelled of disinfectant, sacred oils, and something organic and wrong, the scent of flesh being systematically dismantled. They unloaded us onto conveyors. Actual conveyors, like the munitions crates I'd hauled 4 decades ago. We were sorted by designation, scanned by auger devices that catalogued our remaining utility, then directed into different processing queues based on our assessed value. I was classified as standard industrial conversion, not valuable enough for specialized programming but functional enough to serve in basic capacity. The robed Mechanicus adepts who evaluated me moved with the eerie synchronization of those who were more machine than human. Their faces were hidden behind brass masks and optical augmentations, their voices synthesized through vox units that stripped away any human warmth. They scanned me with devices that made my teeth ache and my skin crawl, instruments that seemed to look through flesh and bone to catalog everything I was made of. One adept, his designation was a string of binary I couldn't comprehend, dictated his findings in a flat, emotionless monotone. Subject 7G 4012 Org. Skeletal structure compromised but salvageable for locomotion mounting. Upper body muscle density adequate for industrial tool interfacing. Cranial capacity sufficient. Cognitive baseline within acceptable parameters for basic task programming. Emotional centers still active, will require standard lobotomization procedures. Memory engrams present but irrelevant. Subject assessed as viable for servitor conversion. Category 4 industrial. Estimated operational lifespan post-conversion 12 to 15 years. 12 to 15 years. They were calculating how long they could use what remained of me before I wore out completely. I tried to speak, tried to form words through my respirator, through my damaged throat, through the crushing weight of realization. I managed a single sound, something between a word and a groan, a desperate vocalization that was the closest I could come to begging. The adept noted it clinically. Subject displays residual self-awareness. Emotional response detected. Psychological resistance potential low. Proceeding with standard conditioning protocols. He gestured to the servitors waiting nearby, and they moved forward to collect me. "Please," I managed, my voice a broken whisper amplified slightly by my respirator. "Please, I served. I've always served. The Emperor, I've given." "Your service is noted and logged in the Administratum archives," the adept interrupted, his synthesized voice devoid of sympathy. "Your continued service will be facilitated through conversion. The Omnisia wastes nothing. The Emperor protects." "Please," I said again, and realized with horrible clarity that this was the first time in decades, perhaps the first time since childhood, that I had actually begged, that I had used my voice to plead for something, that I had acknowledged, out loud, that I wanted something different than what the Imperium had decided for me. It changed nothing. The servitors dragged me to the preparation chambers, Rows of metal tables bolted to the floor, each one stained with old blood and chemical residue, despite repeated cleansing. They stripped me naked, the cloth of my work uniform tearing away easily, rotted by years of acid exposure. My body was revealed in all its ruined glory, emaciated limbs, spine visibly crooked beneath skin, the respirator housing protruding from my chest like a parasite, chemical burns and radiation scars covering every surface. I was dying already, had been dying for years. They were simply repurposing the process. They strapped me down with heavy restraints, thick bands of reinforced leather and metal that locked across my chest, waist, and limbs. The table was cold against my back and tilted slightly so that my head was lower than my feet. Blood rushed to my skull, pressure building behind my eyes. The preliminary surgeries began immediately. No anesthetic, no mercy. Just the cold efficiency of tech priests who viewed flesh as sacred material to be reshaped according to the Omnissiah's will. They started with my legs. I felt the first incision, a line of fire traced from hip to knee as the surgical blade parted skin and muscle. I screamed, the sound echoing in the chamber, joining the screams of dozens of others undergoing similar procedures. The tech priests worked without acknowledging my agony, their movements precise and unhurried. They peeled back the flesh of my thighs, exposing muscle and bone. I could see it if I craned my neck, my own anatomy laid open, glistening red and white, steam rising from the exposed tissue. They injected something directly into the muscle, a preservative perhaps, or a coagulant to prevent excessive bleeding, that burned like promethium fire. Then they brought out the surgical saw. The sound is what I remember most, a high-pitched whine as the blade bit into bone, cutting through my femur with mechanical precision. The vibration traveled through my entire body, making my teeth chatter, making my ribs shake. I could smell burning bone, an acrid, organic stench that mixed with the disinfectant and sacred oils. They amputated both legs at the hip, disconnected them, removed them, carried them away to some other part of the facility where they would be rendered down for their component materials. Nothing wasted, nothing sacred, just meat and bone being recycled into the Imperium's endless mechanisms. The bleeding was controlled by cauterization, burning the severed arteries closed with instruments that hissed and smoked. I felt consciousness slipping, my brain trying to shut down from the trauma, but they injected me with stimulants that dragged me back to awareness. They wanted me conscious, wanted my brain active and processing while they worked. The locomotion units were next. Industrial mechanisms designed for factory floors tracked wheels instead of feet, powered by a small engine that would be connected to my metabolism. They bolted them directly to my pelvic bone, drilling into the skeletal structure, threading connection cables through the stumps where my legs had been. Every drill bit that penetrated bone sent shock waves through my nervous system. Every connection they made was a new violation, a new boundary crossed between human and machine. My arms came next. The left arm was removed entirely, replaced with an industrial welding torch, a massive device that would be triggered by neural impulses they'd program into my brain. The right arm was converted into a material clamp, the bones reinforced with metal struts, the fingers fused together and replaced with vice-like mechanisms. They worked on my torso, removing organs they deemed unnecessary, my stomach, much of my intestines, my spleen. These would be replaced with nutrient processing systems that would sustain me on chemical fuel rather than food. They removed my respirator and replaced it with a more efficient atmospheric processing unit built directly into my chest cavity. And then they came for my mind. The neural interface was a crown of metal and wire fitted around my skull and drilled into the bone at 12 points. Each drill penetration made me see white, made me taste copper, made me scream sounds that no longer resembled human language. They connected cables to the interface, threading them into my brain tissue, establishing pathways that would allow external programming to override my autonomy. The lobotomization was surgical and precise. They didn't remove my brain, that would be wasteful. They simply carved away the parts they didn't need. The sections responsible for complex emotion, for self-directed thought, for everything that made me an individual rather than a tool. I felt it happening. Felt pieces of myself disappearing, memories fading, thoughts becoming sluggish, the constant internal narrative that had accompanied me for 59 years growing quiet, then silent. The last coherent thought I had as myself, as 7G 4012, as the child in the sorting cages, as the laborer in the forge, as the guardsman in the trenches, as the contaminated worker in the radiation fields, was this: I should have died years ago. They kept me alive past the point where life had meaning, just to reach this moment, just to extract every final fragment of utility from flesh that should have been granted the Emperor's peace decades before. Then they installed the obedience inhibitors, and even that thought vanished into static. When the conversion was complete, when I had been transformed from human into servitor, from person into property, they uploaded my programming through the neural interface. Simple instructions, endlessly looping: weld, move to designated coordinates, weld, return to charging station, repeat. I was no longer capable of questioning, no longer capable of resisting. I was servitor unit 7G 4012S, and I would serve until I broke time stopped meaning anything. Not because I couldn't perceive it. The neural programming they'd installed maintained basic chronological awareness necessary for task completion, but because it no longer mattered. There was no past to remember clearly, no future to anticipate, only the eternal present of weld, move, recharge, weld, move. The shipyard where they assigned me was called Orbital Construction Platform Gamma 7. Though I only knew this because the designation was painted on every bulkhead in letters 3 meters high. It stretched beyond any horizon I could perceive, a massive industrial complex suspended in the void, where the hulls of Imperial warships were assembled piece by massive piece. I worked in Section 48D, welding hull plates onto the skeletal superstructure of vessels whose names I was not programmed to know. My left arm, the welding torch, operated with mechanical precision, creating fusion seams that joined adamantium plates in bonds stronger than the metal itself. My right arm, the clamp, held the plates steady while I worked, exerting force that would have crushed human bones, but which the industrial mechanisms handled without strain. I was good at my function. The quality control servitors never flagged my work. The efficiency ratings logged by my neural interface consistently exceeded baseline expectations by 3.7. This was noted in my operational file as satisfactory performance. I did not feel pride. Pride had been carved away. But something remained, some fragment of awareness that the lobotomization had missed, or that had somehow persisted despite the neural programming meant to suppress it. Not thoughts exactly. Not in the way I had once experienced them, complex, interconnected, self-directed. More like echoes. Whispers at the edges of my consciousness that the obedience inhibitors couldn't quite silence. I would be welding a hull plate, my torch burning at precisely 2847 degrees, and some small part of me would recognize the arc of the flame, would remember, dimly, distantly, another fire. The forges of Hive Tertius. Heat that pressed against skin that was mine, before they replaced so much of it with metal and synthetic tissue. The memory would surface for a fraction of a second, then sink back beneath the programming like a stone disappearing into dark water. Weld, move, weld, move. Other servitors worked beside me. Hundreds of us, perhaps thousands, spread across the construction platform in carefully organized work crews. We moved in coordination, our neural interfaces synchronized to prevent collision, our tasks divided with mathematical precision to maximize efficiency. Some of the servitors were new conversions, their organic components still relatively fresh, their movements retaining some trace of human hesitation before the programming overrode it. Others were ancient, their flesh gray and withered, held together more by augmetics and sacred oils than by any remaining biological integrity. These veterans moved with absolute mechanical certainty, no trace of humanity left to interfere with function. I would eventually become like them. I understood this in some dim, suppressed corner of awareness. But in the beginning, in what I think were the early years of my service, I was something between. My flesh was ruined, yes. My mind was lobotomized, yes. But fragments persisted, ghosts of who I had been, trapped in the machine I had become. I remembered a face once, not clearly, just the impression of features, the sense of someone who had looked at me with something other than assessment or calculation. My mother, perhaps, or maybe just another worker in the forge, someone I'd stood beside for years without learning their name. The memory surfaced while I was welding a support beam, triggered by nothing I could identify, and for that brief moment I felt something the inhibitors couldn't quite suppress: loss. Then the programming reasserted itself, and the feeling was buried beneath the imperative weld, move, weld, move. The servitors who had been converted longer sometimes displayed malfunctions. Unit 3H88891S, who worked 3 stations to my left, began weeping one day. Not from emotion. Emotion required components he no longer possessed, but as a mechanical failure. Tears leaked continuously from his eyes, which no longer blink, running down his face in tracks that irritated the skin. He worked for 11 days like this, his tears dripping onto the hull plates he welded, evaporating in the heat of his torch, before the maintenance crews noticed and replaced his lacrimal systems with something more reliable. Unit 9K2047ES developed a vocalization glitch. His speech synthesis unit had degraded, and he began making sounds, not words, just raw noise, a continuous low moan that emerged from his vox grill without pause. He moaned while he worked, while he moved, while he recharged. The sound was eventually deemed disruptive to operational efficiency, and they removed his vocalization capacity entirely. I witnessed these malfunctions with that strange, suppressed awareness. Some part of me recognized them, not as mechanical failures, but as the last protests of whatever fragments of humanity remained in those converted bodies. The weeping, the moaning, the final futile expressions of suffering that could no longer be consciously experienced, but which leaked through damaged systems like blood through bandages. I wondered, in the brief moments when wondering was possible, if I would malfunction similarly, if some part of me would break in a way that expressed the anguish I could no longer feel. The work continued for years, or decades. The chronological markers in my neural interface tracked time, but without context, numbers meant nothing. I welded hull plates on ships that would carry soldiers to wars I would never see, that would participate in campaigns whose outcomes wouldn't touch my existence in any meaningful way. I was a tool that contributed to the Imperium's vast mechanisms, one microscopic component in an engine so large that my individual contribution was statistically insignificant. And yet I continued. Because continuing was my programming. Because the neural interface would not permit me to stop unless ordered. Because the obedience inhibitors made cessation of function impossible without external authorization. But my body continued to fail. The organic components that remained, the portions of my brain, the fragments of digestive system, the cardiovascular tissue that still circulated blood, were dying, slowly, inevitably. The radiation damage from decades ago, the chemical poisoning, the cumulative trauma of a lifetime spent being exploited, all of it manifested in progressive system failures. My liver began to necrotize first. I became aware of it as a dull sensation, not pain exactly because the pain receptors had been modified, but a wrongness in my torso that my neural interface flagged as suboptimal performance. The maintenance servitors examined me, scanned my failing organ with auger devices, and updated my operational file. Hepatic failure, advanced stage, systemic toxin accumulation detected, compensatory filtering systems insufficient, subject operational capacity declining at 0, 3 per solar week, estimated time to critical failure 18 to 24 months. They did not replace my liver. That would require resources better spent on more valuable units. Instead, they adjusted my chemical fuel mixture to reduce stress on the failing organ and marked me for increased monitoring. My kidneys followed 6 months later. Then infection set in, poorly maintained augmetics providing entry points for bacteria that my weakened immune system couldn't fight. The infections were treated with broad-spectrum antibiotics administered directly into my fuel mixture, but they never fully cleared. They became chronic, persistent, slowly eating away at the boundary between flesh and metal. I could smell my own decay, the scent of infection and necrotic tissue that seeped from beneath my augmetic housings, mixing with the sacred oils used to maintain my mechanical components. I smelled like the corpses I'd seen in the radiation fields, like meat that was dying while still technically alive. And still I worked, welded, moved, until the day my neural interface flagged a critical alert during a routine efficiency scan. I was processed through evaluation, scanned more thoroughly than I had been in years. The tech priests examined the data with their characteristic dispassion, cataloging my failures in clinical detail: multiple organ failure, systemic infection, stage 4, cardiovascular insufficiency, neurological degradation in non-critical sectors, augmetic interface rejection in progress. Subject has exceeded operational lifespan projections by 2 years, notable statistical variance. However, continued function no longer cost-effective. Repair procedures would exceed 73% of unit replacement cost. The final assessment was stamped into my file with a seal I couldn't see but somehow knew was there. Unit 7G4012S, irreparable. Suitable only for component reclamation. Authorization granted for immediate processing. Reclamation. That word triggered something in the suppressed fragments of my consciousness, a memory of the radiation fields, of recovering sacred machines from corpses. But this time, I was the corpse. I was the thing to be dismantled, to be reduced to components, to be recycled into the Imperium's endless mechanisms. They transported me to Reclamation Bay 7, a massive facility that processed thousands of failed servitors daily. I was loaded onto a conveyor, just as I had been loaded when I arrived for conversion decades ago. Full circle, beginning and ending in the same position, cargo. The bay smelled of old meat and sacred oils, of disassembly and reduction, of the final processing that awaited everything the Imperium used until it broke. As the conveyor carried me toward the disassembly stations, that suppressed awareness surfaced one more time. Not thoughts, not prayers, not even really consciousness in any meaningful sense. Just recognition. This was the end, the true end, not death. I had died years ago, when they carved away everything that made me human. This was something more final. This was erasure, the reduction of even my mechanical existence to raw materials. And somewhere in the darkness where my mind had retreated, in the spaces between the programming and the neural inhibitors, I felt something that the lobotomization had supposedly removed: relief. The disassembly station was efficient in the way that all Imperial facilities were efficient, designed not for comfort or dignity, but for maximum throughput with minimum resource expenditure. I was conveyed into a chamber where dozens of failed servitors awaited processing, our bodies arranged in neat rows on parallel tracks that fed into the reclamation machinery. The air was thick, heavy with the stench of organic decay inadequately masked by sacred oils and industrial disinfectants. Incense burners hung from the ceiling, trailing smoke that was supposed to sanctify the process, to make the dismantling of what had once been human into an act of devotion rather than butchery. The smoke made my remaining organic tissue want to cough, but my respiratory system no longer responded to such impulses without programmatic authorization. Tech priests moved through the chamber in their red robes, muttering litanies in binary and Gothic, blessing the machinery that would tear us apart. They carried sensors that swung on chains, spreading more of that cloying incense, and data slates that tracked the progress of each unit through the reclamation process. One of them paused beside my conveyor. His face was hidden behind a brass mask etched with sacred formulas, his eyes replaced by optical sensors that glowed a dim red. He scanned me with a handheld auger device, the machine spirit within chirping and clicking as it catalogued my components. Servitor Unit 7G4012S, he intoned, his voice synthesized and emotionless. Operational duration 23.4 years, exceeded projections by significant margin. Welding efficiency rating consistently above baseline. Total hull plates processed 473,612. Quality control failures 0. A faithful servant of the Omnissiah. He marked something on his data slate, then moved on to the next unit without further acknowledgement. 473,000 hull plates. I had contributed to the construction of approximately 47 Imperial warships, according to the calculations my neural interface automatically performed. Ships that would carry tens of thousands of soldiers. Ships that would participate in battles I would never know about, in sectors of space whose names had never been uploaded into my programming. My entire servitor existence reduced to production metrics. But even that was more recognition than I had received as a human laborer, as a guardsman, as a contaminated worker. At least as a servitor, they had tracked my output. The conveyor lurched forward, carrying me toward the first disassembly station. And that was when I felt it. When the degradation of my neural inhibitors, years of poor maintenance, system failures, and biological decay, finally created a gap in the programming. A moment of clarity that shouldn't have been possible. I was aware, not fully, not as I had been before conversion, but more than I had been in decades. The suppressed fragments of consciousness suddenly had space to surface, to connect, to briefly reassemble into something resembling a self. I remembered, not everything. The lobotomization had carved away too much for complete recollection. But I remembered enough: the sorting cages, the forge, the trenches, the radiation fields, the conversion table, the endless welding, all of it compressed into a rush of sensation and recognition that my damaged brain could barely process. I had been human once. I had been a person with a designation that became my name, with a life measured in labor and suffering, with a body that had been exploited until there was nothing left to exploit except the manner of its final disposal. And now, in these last moments, I was aware enough to understand what was happening. The first station removed my augmetics. Tech priests and servitors worked with practiced efficiency, disconnecting the welding torch from my left arm mounting, unscrewing the material clamp from my right. They removed the locomotion units from my pelvic assembly, detaching the power systems and neural interfaces with care, not for my sake, but because these components were valuable. Blessed machine parts that would be sanctified, repaired, and installed in the next servitor who needed them. Each removal created new awareness. As they disconnected my augmetics, the neural pathways that had been dedicated to controlling them went silent, and in that silence, more of my organic consciousness had room to exist. I felt my phantom limbs, the legs and arms I had lost decades ago, suddenly present again in my mind's perception, aching with remembered pain. I tried to vocalize, tried to make some sound through my mechanical Vox grill, but my speech synthesis had been removed years ago after it was deemed unnecessary for my function. All that emerged was a faint electronic hiss, a burst of static that meant nothing to anyone listening. The conveyor moved me to the second station. Here they began the organic reclamation. A robed Medicae, his face covered by a surgical mask, his eyes tired and indifferent behind protective goggles, examined my failing body with clinical detachment. He consulted a data slate, marked certain areas of my torso with a grease pencil, then gestured to his servitor assistants. They started with my organs. The ones that were still marginally functional, portions of my lungs, my heart struggling and diseased but still beating, segments of my digestive tract, were removed with surgical precision. These were placed in preservation tanks filled with cloudy fluid, labeled with designations I couldn't read, and wheeled away to storage facilities where they would be evaluated for potential transplantation into more valuable recipients. My heart, the organ that had beaten for 59 years as a human and 23 years as a servitor, that had circulated blood through flesh, that had hauled munitions and fired lasguns and breathed toxic atmospheres, removed and placed in a tank, still twitching with residual electrical impulses. I watched it happen. My optical sensors still functioned, still fed data to my dying brain. I saw my own heart lifted from my chest cavity, trailing connection tissues and blood vessels, and deposited into preservation fluid, where it would wait to power someone else's existence. The irony was not lost on me, even in my damaged state. My body had never been my own. Not in the sorting cages, not in the forge, not in the trenches, not in the conversion facility. And even in death, even in this final reduction, it continued to serve purposes I had no say in. The Medicae moved on to my skeletal structure. My bones, weakened by radiation, compressed by decades of labor, but still structurally intact enough to be useful, were marked for the corpse starch refineries. They would be ground into powder, processed into protein paste, and fed to the next generation of workers who would stand in sorting cages and wonder why the food tasted of rust and rendered protein. I would become the paste I had eaten as a child. The circle was complete. My skin and remaining soft tissues, damaged by chemical burns, riddled with infection, mostly worthless, were designated for the rendering vats. There they would be boiled down into component materials, fats for industrial lubricants, proteins for fertilizer, trace minerals for chemical processes I didn't understand and had never been taught. Nothing wasted. Every fragment of my existence extracted and repurposed. The Imperium's perfect efficiency, demonstrated in the systematic dismantling of a life that had lasted 82 years and produced exactly 0 moments of joy, peace, or meaning beyond service. As they worked, as they reduced me piece by piece to raw materials, my consciousness began to fade again. Not from the inhibitors this time, those had long since failed, but from simple biological reality. My brain was dying. Without my heart to pump blood, without my lungs to provide oxygen, the neurons that held the fragments of my awareness began firing their last signals. In those final moments, as my vision dimmed and the sounds of the reclamation bay grew distant, I saw a tech priest approach with a data slate. He scanned the tag that had been attached to my processing station, then entered something into his device. I couldn't read the screen from my position, but I knew what it said. Had known since the physician stamped my file in the unguent factories, my final designation. The last classification I would ever receive, Biomass Reclamation Unit 7G4012R, processed for nutritional redistribution. From human to laborer to soldier to contaminated asset to augmented stock to servitor to biomass. 7 reclassifications across 82 years, 7 different ways of measuring my worth, of calculating my utility, of determining how much more could be extracted from flesh that should have been granted rest decades before. I had lived long enough to be reclassified into the very system that created me, lived long enough to close the circle, lived long enough to become the beginning again, the grey-brown paste that would be dispensed from steel spouts into the cupped hands of children in sorting cages, children who would taste rust and rendered protein and never know they were eating the rendered remains of workers who had lived and suffered and died to keep the Imperium's machinery grinding forward. My last thought, as the neurons finally stopped firing, and my consciousness dissolved into the void, was not profound. It was not a prayer to the Emperor whose name had been invoked over every suffering I'd endured. It was not a curse against the Imperium that had consumed me. It was simply this: at least it's over. And then even that awareness was gone, and I was nothing but component materials being sorted, catalogued, and redistributed according to the cold, merciless efficiency of a system that would continue grinding forward long after every atom of my existence had been recycled into new forms, new bodies, new servants, who would suffer their own classifications and reclamifications until they too were reduced to paste and rendered fat and bone powder. In the Imperium of man, nothing is wasted, not resources, not machinery, not lives. And certainly not hope, because hope, like everything else, is carefully measured, rationed, and extracted until there is nothing left but the dry husk of service and the final mercy of complete dissolution. The Emperor protects, but he does not save. He merely uses until there is nothing left to use. End the tale of designation 7 Gamma 4012 is concluded. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war and the grinding machinery of the Imperium that consumes its servants as surely as it consumes its enemies.